Lee, that was a lot of heavy stuff about leadership. So to rest our minds, I'm going to share with you a little bit about myself. I grew up in a Christian household and went to church almost every Sunday, and I couldn't stand it. I thought church was a social event, and I wanted nothing of it. Now, I knew that God was real, but I did not ask him into my heart. I also had a Bible, my grandfather's, but I never opened it. In fact, on Sundays, when the camera zoomed in to the audience during football games to show the signs, I always thought it was stupid that someone would have a sign that said John 3:16. What did that mean? My life centered around me, myself, and I. When I was 15, I began to exercise regularly, and I went from a 90-pound weakling to about 135 pounds of muscle. By the time I was 20, I was 180 pounds of solid muscle. I was also pretty smart, and I felt like if I couldn't solve something mentally, I could solve it physically. I was on top of the world, or so I thought. And then one night at 2 a.m. in the morning, I'm watching this movie about the crucifixion of Jesus. We only had 3 channels back then. The scene that really bothered me was when the Jews chose Barabbas, a known murderer, over Jesus to be released. It made no sense. It made me sick to my stomach. I could not sleep. I just couldn't understand letting a murderer go free and crucifying a just man. So at 6 a.m., I rushed over to my parents' house, bust through the door, and said, Mom, tell me about Barabbas. She was like, Barabbas who? So I waited for my dad to come down. Dad, tell me about Barabbas. Barabbas who? I could tell this conversation was going nowhere fast. So I went back to my apartment, opened up my grandfather's Bible, and quickly closed it because I had no idea what I was looking at. Fortunately for me, I had a Gideon's New Testament. We didn't have internet back then either. And as I opened up the cover, I saw some scriptures and I said, that's me, that's me, that's me, that's me, that's me. Sinner's prayer, I prayed it. For me, accepting Jesus as my Lord was that simple. Getting right with God was another thing. I had a sin problem. Pride, selfishness, and self-sufficiency, which God calls an abomination in multiple parts of the Bible, to include Proverbs chapter 6 and 16. I needed a humbling like Job. 2 weeks later, my trials and testing began. I was now in the most excruciating pain I'd ever been in my life. I couldn't hold any food down, and when I went to the bathroom, it was bloody water. I was admitted to the hospital, and within 3 weeks, I went from 180 pounds of solid muscle to 90 pounds of skin and bones. I knew that if I caught a cold, it'd be the end of my life. Everyone expected me to curse God, hate the world, and die. But instead, I felt the greatest love and peace I had ever experienced in my life as I fellowshipped with God. In fact, several weeks later, when I was healthy enough to leave my hospital room, I went down to the hospital courtyard and I was reading the New Testament when a middle-aged woman walked by me and then came back and said, "Excuse me, your face is glowing. What are you reading?" And I was able to share with her the love of Jesus and help her through a tough period in her life. Now, what was wrong with me? The doctor said I had the worst case of Crohn's colitis that they had ever seen. They wanted to cut out my entire intestines and replace them with plastic. They said that I would not be able to handle any type of stress and that I'd be a vegetable the rest of my life. The doctors also put me on up to 120 milligrams of prednisone steroid a day for well over a year. And if you know anything about prednisone, you should never take more than 20 milligrams at a time, and that for only a few days. Otherwise, it can cause more harm than good. Well, I refused to get the operation. And over the next 18 months, I was in and out of hospitals for multiple emergencies. In fact, one of them was for a temporary colostomy. And on the way to the hospital, the doctor said I should have died because my colon should have burst. They also said because of where the temporary colostomy was, that it was most likely going to be permanent. 3 months later, to their astonishment, they put me back 100% together. I was still very sick, but I was a little bit better. During this time, in and out of hospitals, I was also reading my Bible and rereading my Bible. And I kept on coming back to 2 verses, James 5:14 to 15. And I'll paraphrase those. Are there any sick among you? Let them call for the elders of the church, and the prayer of the faith shall make them whole. If there be any sins, they shall be forgiven them, and they will anoint their head with oil. Now, I'm not going to lie. I was embarrassed and scared, but I believed God's word to be true, that he had led me to those verses on purpose, and that he was either going to heal me now on this earth, or he was going to take me home to heaven. And I was comfortable with either answer. So I stepped out in faith, and I went to our pastor. He called in the elders of the church. I got down on my knees. They anointed my head with oil, and then each one of them prayed over me. I did not feel one bit different, but I knew that God had healed me. A few months later, I joined the army when I couldn't even climb 2 steps with 1 foot. I became a paratrooper, a person that jumps out of perfectly good airplanes. I also became a jump master, the person in charge of inspecting the paratroopers' equipment and then exiting them out of the aircraft. It was a heavy responsibility that I did not take lightly. Their lives were literally in my hands. I fought in 1 war and 2 conflicts. I should have been killed 5 times in Iraq. So what am I getting at? Those 18 months where my life was completely dependent on God is where I developed my leadership philosophy.